When we first approached the abandoned mansion, it looked like time itself had forgotten it. The windows were clouded with dust, vines had overtaken parts of the stone walls, and the air around it was unnaturally still. The front door creaked, open with the gentlest push, revealing a grand entryway covered in cobwebs and fallen plaster. Most of the rooms were in ruins, water-damaged walls, shattered glass, furniture reduced to skeletal frames. We were recording everything for our vlog, hoping to catch eerie shots, maybe even something paranormal. But none of us were prepared for what we found in the basement. The entrance to the basement was hidden behind a broken shelf in what used to be the pantry. The staircase was steep, rotting, and smelled like mold and rust. I remember how heavy the air got as we descended, like we were walking into a forgotten pocket of the world. The basement was vast, mostly empty, aside from some old crates and a rusted boiler. But in the far corner, behind some stacked wooden planks, we noticed something strange. A door, not just any door, it was thick, old, and heavily bolted with a rusted iron latch. From the outside, the door didn't match the rest of the house, while everything else was rotting and falling apart. This door looked disturbingly intact. Clean wood, strong frame, no dust around the edges. It was like someone had taken care of it, maintained it, long after the rest of the mansion had been abandoned. That in itself was bizarre. But what truly froze us in place was that this door wasn't marked on the blueprint we had downloaded the night before. The basement was supposed to end with the boiler wall. There was no room on the other side, at least not officially. One of the guys corked up and placed his ear against the wood. I told him not to, but he waved me off. A few seconds passed in silence, then his expression shifted. Confused, pale. He backed away quickly and said, "There's something behind it. I think it's knocking." We all went quiet. At first, I thought he was messing with us, until we heard it. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not aggressive, measured. Intentional, like someone, or something, was trying to let us know it was there. None of us spoke. We stood still, staring at the door, waiting for another sound. It came again, 3 knocks. Same rhythm. This time, the iron latch on the outside vibrated slightly, like it had absorbed the force. The door didn't move, it stayed perfectly shut. But that somehow made it worse. If it had been banging or creaking, we could have blamed it on air pressure or the old house settling. But this was deliberate. We debated what to do. Eric wanted to open it. He said maybe someone got trapped down there, some squatter or kid, playing a game that went too far. But the door was bolted tightly. It would take effort to undo it, and something inside me begged us not to. I told the group this door wasn't meant to be opened, that it was shut for a reason. Jay agreed with me. He had been quiet ever since we heard the knock, just staring at the bolt. Jaw clenched as we stood there arguing. The temperature around us dropped sharply. Our breath became visible. It was like the air from behind the door had started leaking into the room. Then came the smell, something damp, old, and metallic, like blood that had dried years ago but never fully faded. We backed away slowly, and as we did, the knocking stopped, replaced by something far worse. Breathing, not ours, something else. A deep, ragged inhale, followed by a slow, shaky exhale. And it was close. Right behind the door, Jay shined his flashlight across the wooden surface and gasped. There, low on the door, were scratch marks. Deep ones, as if fingernails had clawed at the wood for hours, days, maybe. Not just one set of marks. Multiple, overlapping. Some fresh, some old and faded. We realized then that whoever had been behind that door hadn't just been locked in. They had tried to get out. Desperately, Eric still wanted to open it. I grabbed his arm and told him if he touched that latch, I'd drag him out myself. He finally backed down. We left the tray of tools we were using and backed up the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The camera in my hand shook with every movement, but I kept filming, needing proof of what we saw, of what we felt. When we reached the top of the stairs, we heard the knocking again. 3 slow knocks. One final message. When we watched the footage later, something didn't add up. In the moment when Eric had his ear to the door, right before he spoke, the audio picked up something. A whisper, faint but clear enough to make out the words, "If you listened closely, let me out, please. I remember you." We never went back after that. The footage went viral, sure, but nothing ever explained that door. Who it was meant to keep out or what it was meant to keep in. As we moved deeper into the mansion, we started noticing things that didn't make sense. At first, it was little details candles that looked recently burned, despite the dust-covered surroundings. A half-empty teacup on a table where everything else had been untouched for years. The strange part was how carefully placed everything looked, as if someone had arranged these items deliberately. Not like a squatter had come through and messed around, but like someone had been living there in secret, keeping up appearances. In the middle of the decay, the deeper we went, the more intense the feeling became. We weren't exploring an abandoned space anymore. We were trespassing somewhere that still belonged to someone. There was a long hallway upstairs where the carpet had been stripped down to the wood. Every door on both sides had been nailed shut, except one. That door stood slightly ajar, and the wallpaper around it had strange hand-drawn symbols etched in charcoal. They weren't decorative, they were frantic, repeated over and over again, in a rushed, shaky pattern, as though someone was desperately trying to keep something in or out. I got closer to take a picture, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, not loud, not angry, just a breathy voice that said, "He's watching." I turned around instantly, thinking one of the guys was behind me, but no one was there. They were still downstairs. I stood completely still, holding my breath, scanning the hallway. Nothing. But I felt it like eyes boring into me from behind the door. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Something about that room didn't want to be disturbed. The whisper wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. Someone or something was watching us, and had been for some time. That's when I realized the mirrors in the mansion were wrong. Every room had at least one, usually tall and old, the kind with ornate frames. But they weren't dusty. They were spotless, like someone had cleaned them recently. I walked into one of the side bedrooms and stood in front of the mirror. That's when I noticed something terrifying. My reflection didn't match my movements. I tilted my head, and the reflection paused a moment too long before following. I lifted my hand, and it hesitated. I took a step back, and the image grinned. I ran out of that room and slammed the door behind me. I didn't tell the others right away. I didn't want them to think I was losing it. But then something similar happened to Jay. He came running out of another room, pale and sweating, saying he'd seen himself standing next to the mirror, not in it. His reflection hadn't mirrored him, it had watched him like a separate being, blinking at the wrong times, smiling without him smiling. We regrouped and started to panic. Eric wanted to keep filming, but even he couldn't explain the footage he was capturing. The camera feed had begun to glitch whenever it pointed toward a mirror. Faces appeared in the reflections, people we didn't recognize, standing behind us, staring, never moving. The mansion suddenly felt alive. Every creak in the floor, every shifting shadow seemed like a conscious action, not the random decay of an old house. I swear we heard footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, even though we were on the top floor. At one point, a door slammed, shut down the hall, though no wind had blown through the house since we entered. The worst part was the clock. An enormous grandfather clock stood in the main hallway, and though it had no pendulum or working parts, it had started ticking, slowly at first, then with more urgency, matching our heartbeat. When we passed it again an hour later, the time had changed, even though we never wound it. It now pointed to 3:33, an oddly specific and unsettling hour. Jay swore the house was shifting. He said the rooms didn't line up anymore. A hallway that once led back to the staircase now looped around and ended at a mirror. We marked walls with chalk to track our movement, but the marks disappeared. Doorways relocated. One. Time. We opened a door, expecting the hallway, and found ourselves looking into a room we'd already left behind on the first floor. It was as though the house was rearranging itself to confuse us, trap us, maybe test us. The lines between real and unreal began to blur. Eric's voice changed slightly in the last hour, more distant, like it echoed even in small spaces. His eyes stopped blinking naturally. I didn't even notice it at first, but when I did, I realized he hadn't blinked in at least 10 minutes. We tried to leave, but the front door was gone. The place where it had once been was now a blank wall. The windows looked outside, but what they showed didn't make sense. We were surrounded by forests when we arrived, but now the view outside the windows showed fog, endless and swirling. No trees, no road, just dense white fog with occasional silhouettes, figures that stood too still, too long, before vanishing again. We had no choice but to go back into the house and search for another way out. That's when we heard music, a piano melody, slow and sad, coming from downstairs. We followed the sound and found the piano room. The keys were moving, playing the song by themselves. No one was there. On the wall above the piano, scrawled in what looked like ash, were the words, "Play along or stay forever." We backed away slowly. Jay whispered, "I think this house wants something from us." And that's when we knew we hadn't discovered the house. It had invited us. Jay had been acting strangely ever since we entered the second floor of the mansion, but none of us really noticed it at first. It started with small things, him standing slightly apart from the group, not responding immediately when we called his name, and occasionally staring off into corners of the room with an expression that didn't match what was happening. We chalked it up to nerves. After all, the atmosphere in the house was oppressive. Every breath felt heavier, and the air seemed to hum with tension. But something about Jay was off. At one point, he walked into a room alone, and when we called out to him, he didn't answer. When he finally returned 10 minutes later, he looked different. He was quieter, more distant, and he kept glancing at the mirrors as if something in them was speaking to him. Later that evening, we reviewed the footage and noticed something that made our stomachs turn. At the exact moment Jay disappeared into that room, the hallway camera caught a flicker of movement behind him. Not a shadow, not a trick of light, but a figure, crawling along the wall like an insect. Pale skin, elongated limbs, no visible face, just a shape moving in a way that no human body should. It slithered around the doorframe as Jay entered, and then the door slowly closed behind him without anyone touching it. When he came back out, The figure was gone, but Jay was not the same. His movements were too smooth, too deliberate, and he never once blinked. We asked him where he went, and he said he didn't remember going into the room at all. Said we must have imagined it. When we showed him the footage, he watched without any reaction, just stared blankly. Then he laughed a short, hollow sound that didn't fit his voice. That was the moment Eric and I knew something was seriously wrong. We decided not to confront him directly, but to keep an eye on him. Unfortunately, whatever had taken hold of Jay knew we were watching. That night, while we tried to sleep in the living room, we heard the soft creak of footsteps moving in a circle around us. We thought it was just the house settling until we looked over and realized Jay was gone. We found him standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at us. His eyes reflected the dim flashlight beam, even though there was no reason for them to shine like that. His mouth was slightly open, and his head tilted in an unnatural angle, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. I whispered his name, and he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he turned and walked into the darkness of the hallway again. We didn't follow him. Not immediately. Something in our instincts screamed that following him would be a mistake. Instead, we waited terrified, huddled together until the early morning light began to peek through the boarded-up windows. When we finally worked up the courage to search, we found Jay asleep on the floor of the master bedroom, curled up like a child. When we tried to wake him, he jerked upright and gasped as if surfacing from water. He asked us why we left him, why we didn't come help him when he called, but we never heard him call. He insisted he had screamed for us all night. He said he was trapped in a different version of the mansion, same rooms, same layout, but the walls were breathing, and the floors were pulsing under his feet. He said he kept opening doors, hoping to find us, but each door led to another copy of the house, deeper and darker. He said he saw himself in the mirrors, multiple versions, all watching him, all whispering things he couldn't understand. That story would have sounded crazy if not for the scratches on his arms. Dozens of them, thin, almost surgical cuts, in patterns we didn't recognize. Not self-inflicted, too precise. Almost like something had been carving into him while he wandered through whatever version of the mansion had taken him. He said he doesn't remember falling asleep, but he remembers something telling him, "Don't fight it, or the others will come." We tried to take him out of the mansion that morning, but the front door still wouldn't appear. The fog outside the windows was thicker than ever, and Jay, well, he started losing time. One moment he'd be talking to us, and the next he'd blink and ask why we were in a different room. Sometimes he'd freeze and whisper something in a language we didn't recognize. Other times he'd suddenly become aggressive, demanding we stop lying or stop pretending to be his friends. That's when we started to question whether the thing we brought out of that room was still Jay at all, or just something wearing his skin. One night, I saw him talking to his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Not just staring, but actually conversing. He was whispering, and then laughing, then crying, then laughing again. When I called his name, he slammed the door shut so hard that the frame cracked. He came out a few minutes later, acting normal, like nothing had happened. The final straw came when we caught him trying to sneak back into the same room, the one with the symbols on the door. He said he needed to finish something. When we stopped him, he looked at us with absolute hatred, like we were the intruders, not him, like we didn't belong there. We locked that room. We don't know what's inside it, but whatever got into Jay, it's still inside him, and we don't think he wants to leave anymore. When we found the old phonograph in the basement, It was covered in dust and surrounded by shattered glass and rotted wood, as if the house itself had tried to bury it. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything special, just another antique in a house full of forgotten relics. But what stood out was the record already on the turntable, untouched by time. No dust, no cracks, as if someone had placed it there recently. Against our better judgment, we decided to play it. The needle dropped with a scratch, followed by silence that stretched just a second too long. Then the music began, soft, slow, and deeply unsettling. It sounded like an old waltz, the kind you'd hear in a long-abandoned ballroom, but it wasn't quite right. The notes wavered unnaturally, like something was trying to mimic music but didn't fully understand how human ears perceive sound. At first, we were just unnerved, but as the melody played on, we started noticing things changing in the basement. The temperature dropped rapidly, our breath becoming visible in the stale air. The lights on our equipment began to flicker, though we had fully charged the batteries before coming down. Then came the whispers, not from the speakers, but from around us, as if the very walls were listening to the song and responding. The whispers didn't form words at first, just fragments of syllables, overlapping and colliding like a broken chorus. We turned off the phonograph, but the whispers continued. That's when we realized we hadn't just played a song, we had awakened something. Jay suddenly clutched his ears and dropped to his knees, crying out in pain. He said the music was still playing in his head, louder than ever, and that he could hear someone calling his name through it. Not just calling, beckoning. He begged us to stop the sound, but the record was no longer turning. The needle had lifted, but Jay said it was still spinning in his mind. He stood up abruptly and began walking toward the far side of the basement, where there was nothing but a brick wall. Then, out of nowhere, he whispered, "She's behind it." We tried to hold him back, but he scratched at the bricks like an animal, convinced there was a door hidden there. We managed to pull him away, but he was in a daze. His eyes were wide, almost vacant, and he kept humming the melody under his breath. We dragged him upstairs and tried to regroup. But that night, as we reviewed the footage, we saw something that made our skin crawl. In the reflection of a broken basement mirror, just behind Jay, as he crouched by the phonograph, was a tall figure. A woman in a tattered dress, head tilted unnaturally, her face obscured by long, black hair. She wasn't visible in real life, only in the mirror. She stood perfectly still while the music played, but the moment the song stopped, she turned and walked backward into the wall, vanishing like smoke. The next day, Jay refused to speak. He just sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the fog. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to questions, and when we tried to play any other sound music, white noise, even conversation, he flinched as though it physically hurt him. But whenever we came near the phonograph, he would perk up, like a dog hearing its owner's voice. He started sleepwalking at night, always heading toward the basement door. We began locking it, but one morning we found him down there, again sitting, cross-legged in front of the phonograph, humming. The record was playing again. We had removed it and locked it away, but it was back on the turntable. No one could explain how. We knew something was wrong with the record itself. We considered destroying it, but when we tried, the lights cut out across the entire house. Every door slammed shut. Our equipment glitched, screens going black or distorting into incomprehensible symbols. Jay screamed louder than we'd ever heard, like he was being torn apart from the inside. And then the phonograph started playing without the record. We couldn't believe what we were hearing. The same haunting waltz, echoing through the rooms, even though the machine was empty. We fled the house that night, dragging Jay with us, but he screamed the entire way. Screamed that we were taking him away from her, that she would come for us now. Even outside, we weren't safe. We played the footage for a paranormal expert, and he noticed something we'd missed. Throughout our basement scenes, there were faint visual distortions, almost like another layer of film overlaying ours. In several frames, the woman from the mirror could be seen in brief flashes, always closer than before. He told us the melody we had recorded was not just sound, it was a ritual, an invitation. And by playing it, we'd allowed a part of something ancient to attach itself to us. A melody meant to lure the soul, not entertain the mind. A song that once heard never leaves you. Jay never fully recovered. Sometimes we still catch him humming that waltz under his breath, eyes glazed over. And at night, we hear faint music through the walls, when no devices are on, when the house is still. We tried throwing the phonograph into the river, but 2 days later, it was on our doorstep, dry and pristine, the record turning slowly. The music never stopped. As we made our way to the attic, the stairs creaked beneath our feet with every step, as though warning us not to proceed. The air grew colder and heavier the closer we got to the top, and by the time we reached the narrow wooden door, a thick layer of dust coated everything in sight. No one had been up there for decades. It was obvious, but something felt off. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't even closed all the way. It stood slightly ajar, like someone had just slipped inside. Moments before us, we exchanged hesitant glances, then slowly pushed the door open. The hinges groaned as if protesting, and what lay beyond chilled us to the bone. The attic was a time capsule. Faded furniture, boxes of brittle newspapers, and cobweb-covered trunks filled the cramped space. But at the far end, near a window, blackened with grime, sat a single wooden rocking chair, and in that chair, a figure. At first, we thought it was a mannequin prop left behind. It was entirely still, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown, with long grey hair flowing down its back. We stepped inside cautiously, whispering to each other as we documented the room. The attic floor groaned beneath us, but the figure in the chair didn't move. It sat completely silent. We got closer, cameras focused, hearts pounding. From behind, it remained still, but the tension in the air was unbearable. One of us, Evan, dared to circle around to see the figure's face. As he reached the front of the chair, he gasped and stumbled back. The figure wasn't a mannequin. It was a real woman, or what used to be one. Her skin was dried and stretched tight over her bones, eyes sunken and lifeless. But her mouth was twisted into a smile far too wide, like her cheeks had been torn open to maintain it. We didn't understand how she could still be upright. Her hands were clutching something in her lap, an old, decayed stuffed rabbit, its eyes missing and its fur worn to threads. We backed away, too afraid to touch her. But then her head twitched, just a tiny movement but unmistakable. The smile widened. We froze. No one breathed. She turned her head an inch more, and though her eyes were sunken and glassy, they were looking right at us. Then, slowly, the chair began to rock. Back and forth, back and forth. We ran, scrambling down the stairs, heartbeats thundering. We didn't stop until we were back on the main floor. But the sounds followed. Slow creaking, the rhythm of the rocking chair. We thought we'd imagined it, just our minds playing tricks on us after everything we had seen. But that night, when we reviewed the footage, the camera's audio caught something else. A soft voice, faint but clear. It said, "He still cries for me." Then a child's voice, barely above a whisper, responded, "Make them stay." We had no idea what it meant, but it made our blood run cold. We scrubbed through the footage again and again, and in one frame, behind the rocking chair, something else was visible. A small figure crouched in the corner. A child, its face obscured, but its outline clear. That was the night the real nightmares began. One by one, each of us started hearing things, particularly at 3:33 a.m. every night. Evan said he heard footsteps pacing just outside his bedroom. Lisa saw a child standing at the foot of her bed, silently weeping before vanishing into thin air. I began hearing the rocking chair creak in my own house, even though there was no chair like that anywhere inside, and the smell everywhere we went of something old, like rotting wood and dried flowers. The woman from the attic was with us, and so was the child. We realized it too late. By entering that space and disturbing her stillness, we had invited them into our lives. Desperate for answers, we dug through the local archives. There had been a family that once lived in that mansion nearly 100 years ago. A woman named Edith and her son, Matthew. The husband had died in an accident, and the boy disappeared soon after. Neighbors believed the grief broke Edith's mind. She locked herself in the attic and was never seen again. When authorities finally entered the house, they found her dead in the rocking chair. But there was no sign of the boy, only a stuffed rabbit left behind. They claimed she had starved herself, rocking in that chair until the very end, waiting for her son to return. But the story didn't end there. Some said her spirit never left the attic, that she continued to wait, that anyone who entered her space without permission became part of her vigil, trapped in the cycle of her mourning. And now that was us. We had seen her, heard her. The boy's voice followed us. The rabbit appeared on Lisa's doorstep one morning, old, dusty, missing its eyes, exactly like the one we saw in her lap. We tried to burn it, but it wouldn't catch fire. Water wouldn't soak it. We left it in the woods, but it came back the next day, sitting on my car's dashboard. Our homes became prisons. Lights flickered, shadows darted through corners, whispers echoed in the silence. The smell grew stronger. Every mirror began reflecting the attic behind us, even though we were miles away from the mansion. The line between their world and ours blurred. We had opened a door we couldn't close. The woman in the attic and her crying son had found us, and they weren't done mourning yet.